Hi, welcome everyone. Welcome to Chapter 11 on organizational behavior, and we're covering off the concept of conflict and negotiations today. I have to say I'm wearing this cardigan now, and I must be getting old because I'm beginning to love cardigans now. So it's just a sign of age, isn't it? When it's comfort wins over style. So today we're going to talk about conflict and negotiations. And the first area that we should start off is really with the conversation of, is conflict good or bad? And I'd like to start this class really about discussing that from a timeline perspective of what the attitudes were from the 1970s to the 1990s and to the current perspectives. And in the 70s, we really thought that conflict was bad. And so all managers were trained at the time to stamp it out. Don't talk about it. Don't discuss it, sweep it under the rug. And because of that, what we see in the modern workplace is that we have managers and leaders currently that operate this way with this mentality and mindset that let's not talk about conflict, let's not deal with it, because they were trained that way in the workplace. So they've just replicated that model of leadership in the workplace. But in the late 1970s to the 1990s, we started to realize that there's an optimal level of conflict where, it's a little bit of conflict is good because it refreshes perspectives, creates some dialogue in the office, and creates some dialogue and discourse that's necessary for the organization to move forward. And because of that, we see organizations now evolving to this perspective that conflict is actually a very healthy thing in organizations because it allows us to be more innovative, more creative in organizations. And in the slide deck, you'll see a timeline and organizations that actually failed to adapt to conflict. And it just gives you an example of all these great examples of organizations that fail. And we talk about the story about the boiling frog, which, if you haven't heard this story before, is really about the fact that organizations can become boiling frogs, which means that in literature is that when you throw a frog into a boiling pot of water, it'll immediately jump out because it senses it's too hot. But if you put a frog in cold water and raise the boiling temperature, it'll never notice that the water is getting hot and boiled alive in that water. I know it's an awful analogy, but it's what we use in business for quite a long time to describe how bad conflict can lead to organizations that fail to see that they're being boiled alive strategically. The good example is, no one ever carries a Sony cell phone anymore, but that's because Sony thought they were so good at the business of making cell phones that they forgot to really think about what people really needed was something that was simple and easy to use. And Apple wondrously won out in that situation. And there's some examples of other organizations that failed. Kodak is a great example with some of the analogies that they had in Kodak film, where I think in the 1960s, 1975, they had 90% of the market share of film. It dropped to 45% in 8 years because of Fujichrome at the time. And in 1995, they were famously quoted as saying that digital will never replace the need for traditional photos. And you see that no one really carries around print photos anymore because of that change with digital technology. So when it comes to workplace conflict, I'd like to start this chapter with really talking about the Center for Creative Leadership. They've really articulated that 20 to 40% of most managers' time is spent dealing with conflict. And managers spend a substantial amount of time in conflict every single day dealing with issues between employees. There's some stats which I'll also share and put the links in the video below, that 85% of employees experience some kind of workplace conflict. 30% of them experience conflict consistently, and 49% of our employees see workplace conflict happening regularly due to personality clashes or egos in the workplace. And what I mean by all these stats, by sharing this, is that by being conflict competent as managers and leaders, we can really improve our ability to work in the office. Being conflict competent, it allows us to successfully navigate and manage issues within the workplace. How many have seen where a coworker was really terrible at dealing with conflict, and it really affected their career in the long run because they were no longer able to work in the office? And what I want to teach in this chapter is really how important it is to become conflict competent. And when we get into the class lecture, we'll talk a lot about techniques and skills that you can practice in the workplace to make yourself much more effective in dealing with conflict. Because I'm sure all of us can raise our hand and give an example or personal story of where we saw a coworker just become miserable because of a conflict in the workplace and not know how to address it, and it just steadily got worse. And I want to make sure that in this class lecture that we teach you how to become conflict competent. And the number is probably rising because the need for many people to work together is getting more. We're collaborating more on issues that are multidimensional and require stakeholder input. And so that's one of the reasons why this chapter is so critical in understanding conflict management. And let's talk about the second concept that you see in the slides, which I really want to highlight as you go through them, is that the emerging view is that there's two types of conflict. Constructive task-based conflict, that's the category one. And the second category is really around relationship-based conflict. And what we want to do in organizations is to minimize relationship-based conflict and create much more constructive task-based conflict. And constructive task-based conflict is really aimed at the issues and the problem, and relationship-based conflict is really aimed at the person or the individuals. The problem is, because we're all emotional beings, we really tend to focus more on relationship conflict as the primary source of the conflict, and we really don't really understand constructive and task conflict very well because it's much more complicated. We tend to blame the person, our coworkers, our stakeholders, blame our boss. And in reality, that really just makes it very dysfunctional in the workplace, and we'll talk a lot about that more in the class as well. And I just want to also make reference to the fact that we're only human. So relationship conflict is actually very normal. The good managers realize that this is normal to get emotional over conflict and accept it, and learn to handle it very quickly and move to constructive and task-based conflict. And we'll talk more about that during the class lecture when we get together in class. Another thing also mentioned in this class is I've abandoned the styles of conflict in the textbook and moved to the TKI model of conflict management. The TKI model, I've seen it used in organizations today, and that's why I've abandoned what's in the class textbook, because I'd like to showcase to you what's being shown in workplaces today around the 5 different conflict management styles, so that you're familiar with what your managers in the workplace are talking about today and potentially apply it for your own teams within the workplace. And I'll give you some examples of how to handle that. How to handle that and how to use that tool within your workplace with some surveys. We'll talk about in this class during the lecture structural approaches to resolve conflict, so make sure you just highlight and touch on that to review the structural approaches to resolve conflict and how to handle that. And one of the things I also want to talk about in today's lecture for conflict and negotiations is really the Harvard Negotiations Project. It doesn't get covered often in your textbook, and I think it's a very important conflict management style. And I just wanted to highlight it because the textbook doesn't even mention it. And it was in the 80s that a bunch of Harvard professors got together and started thinking about, well, there's really 2 general approaches to dealing with conflict, a hard style and a soft style. There's got to be a better way. And what they articulated and they started to design was what's called the principled style of negotiations. That literature, that research actually formed some literature, which hopefully I can find really quickly on this text. Yeah. So, which formed the text of these 2 books here called Getting to Yes and Getting Past No. They were written by Roger Fisher and William Ury. This is a really old copy. It's getting yellow, but it's still fundamentally very good. And what these professors started to realize when it comes to conflict, that when it comes to organizational behavior and how to deal with conflict, they thought and they realized that there's got to be a better way than just dealing with conflict through either hard and soft approaches. And they came up with this solution called the principled style negotiation, where participants are really the problem solvers in all of this. The goal is really a wise outcome. And they created 5 key steps on dealing with conflict. And for me, I think, you don't really need to buy this follow-up book, which was written 10 years later. But this Getting to Yes, if you go to a used bookstore, you could probably find tons of these copies, because tons of these are lying around. And I love it because it has these 5 key steps on dealing with conflict, and William Ury does a fantastic job. And I've attached some TED Talks from William Ury on how to deal with conflict in the lecture notes that you guys can watch at your own leisure. And then I'd like to debrief what you learned watching those TED Talks during class as well. So I've attached the Harvard negotiations conflict management style in your lecture notes for the class. So take a gander, take a look, and we can discuss any questions that you have on that. And during the class lecture, I'll also bring a few perspectives. One of us recent students brought this book to my knowledge, which is Never Split the Difference by Chris Voss. I like this book a lot. It was a great piece of literature in which we'll talk and debrief about how a former FBI hostage negotiator uses these field-tested tools and how to deal with conflict and negotiations and apply it in the workplace. So I'll bring that, and we can talk a little bit about that during the class lecture. And so other than that, it's a 10-minute long video. So I'll see you soon in the class lecture on chapter 11. See you guys soon. Bye.